Hello and welcome back to Israel with Aline. We are in Jerusalem and we are going to show you some of the city's most recent archaeological excavations that show the probable location of Jesus' trial by Pontius Pilate, a subject still very controversial among historians and archaeologists. And to study and show us all this, I also invite archaeologist Rodrigo Silva with us today. Shalom, shalom.
Malini, shalom to everyone joining us now.
It's a pleasure to have you here with us today then. And
let's talk about controversy, news and new theories about the life of Jesus.
Indeed, much controversy. So if you guys are ready, let's get started.
Shalom and welcome back to Israel with Aline. We are in Jerusalem and we are going to show you some of the city's most recent archaeological excavations. Aline, so we are going to have a chat here about this recent find, this discussion in the academy also about the place here. But before, let's situate the folks at home where we are. Because I said that we are in Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is a big city. You must be even impressed, thinking that the place of Jesus' trial has to do with that tower back there. What place is this? What tower is that? Where are we now?
We are now outside the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, very close to the Jaffa Gate, the Job Gate, which is one of the 8 gates of the old city of Jerusalem. The gate is right behind this tower, and this tower is the famous King David's tower.
You notice she used quotation marks, correct? Why quotation marks? Because
it's not a tower and it's not of David. Let's then explain what this place actually is. What we are seeing is that small tower. In reality, it's a minaret. It's a tower of a mosque, what we call a minaret in a relatively modern period. We are talking about the time of the Turkish Ottoman period. Underneath the minaret, yes, there is a fortified tower, but it was not built by King David, but rather it was built by King Herod. So that tower, its original name is Pasael, or in Hebrew, Pasael. So that is the Tower of Pasael, built by King Herod the Great 2,000 years ago. That is 1,000 years after David. But David ended up getting the fame, even though it was actually built by King Herod.
Look, the wind here passes and we keep doing and building the narrative. But you notice then, right? It's because in the time of the Ottomans, which Linda is talking about, they started to stamp the Ottomans themselves on things that were not necessarily biblical, but they picked up a wrong tradition. And many pilgrims at that time thought that there was King David's palace, and it was even called the City of David, although we know that the City of David is on the other side, down there, right? Far away from where we are. And now see what's interesting when she also talks about recent for the history of Israel, which is millennial, but we're talking about something close to 500 years old. That is almost the age of the discovery of Brazil. So there we have a tower from the Ottoman period. The Ottoman period begins here in Jerusalem in 1517, 17 years after Brazil was discovered. And below you have the structure of a palace of Herod, which is described by Flavius Josephus. There were other towers, like Mariamne's too. He even named people he had ordered to kill. The hero said Marada was complicated and ordered the killing of family members whose names were put on the towers. And one of them survived, which is exactly the one of
Pasael in
Hebrew. It's harder to pronounce. Well, now we have it down there, and you can see that there are already structures of a wall. This wall is a mix of the wall from the time of Herod, the wall from the time of the Hasmoneans, which is from the time before the birth of Jesus, and walls even from the time of the first temple. Because when we talk about the old city of Jerusalem, it's also good to explain, Aline, that the old city doesn't always have the same outline as biblical Jerusalem. There are times when what is now called the old city coincides with walls from the biblical era, and there are times when it does not. But here it coincides with walls from the time of Solomon, the Maccabees, and also the time of Herod. Shall we get closer there? Let's look at some pieces of that wall for you to understand. Let's go! Now, Aline, you know the history of Herod very well. You even studied it. Indeed, and everyone knows that Herod... this noise here I want to stop to explain. Folks, welcome to the traffic of Israel. Do you see the cars stopped here? It's because someone is trying to enter the old city, but they are not authorized. So the gate doesn't open for him. It forms a line here and people start honking.
Yeah, people here like to honk a lot. In the entire Middle East, Israel is no exception. So the issue is that sometimes people come here and they don't know. Sometimes they are even tourists and they don't know that to enter the old city, you need to have authorization, which is usually for people who work or live there. Not just anyone can drive around the old city, but they can park here and continue walking, take advantage of this.
Wonderful city. And even some people say that the car horn is the third official language of Israel. You have Hebrew, you have Arabic, and you have the car horn. Without the horn, drivers don't know how to drive. But let's talk anyway. If the horn sounds, add it up.
To the environment.
Welcome to Israel.
The traffic.
From here. But as I was saying, Herod, what he had of perverse, of Machiavellian, of bad character, he also had of an excellent builder. He ordered to do pharaonic things. And he also took advantage of old buildings, as he still does today. People take advantage of a foundation and build on top of it. And we're going to show you a little bit of Herod's construction, what he reused. Here behind us, we have Herodian-style stones at the corner. How do we know they are Herodian? Because they have this little belly here, this bulge in the middle. Do you see? And there's a framing as if it were a
framer.
Around here, that's typical of Herod. So he had a kind of retaining wall built here to hold the structure of his palace, which would be behind these walls. These walls here are not from the time of Herod. They are from the 16th century, right? But they are in the place where in the past there would have been a wall of Herod. But he also took advantage of other older walls. Behind here you have a wall from the Hasmonean period, which is before Herod. And you see that the stones are different. So you have walls from one era, walls from another, but both very old. And
even older than the Hasmonean wall, which is around 2,200 years old, is what's underneath. You can see here, folks, that we are looking at tombs. These are tombs carved into the rock. We can see that there is one next to the other. This was how the Jews were buried during the time of the first temple of Jerusalem, which is also similar to how it was done in the times of Jesus. When Joseph of Arimathea gives his tomb to Jesus, it is said it is tomb carved in the rock. So the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, which became the tomb of Jesus, was similar, some elements to this one. So how did it work? They dug a tomb in the rock. The place inside is now closed with a grate. We can't go in, but the horns are part of it.
True. If
we go in there, we can see that there are spaces to put the bodies. So the bodies were brought here. They closed the entrance here. That is, the lid disappeared over time, but this entrance was closed. After a year, they came back. They collected the bones and put the bones aside.
So
this shows the Jewish presence here in Jerusalem at the time of the first temple of Jerusalem. That is, these tombs could be up to 3,000 years old.
And look how interesting, with few exceptions, people were buried outside the city with few exceptions. David, for example, was buried in the city of David, and some kings as well. But ordinary people, even if they had financial means, were on the outside. And here we are outside the walls. Another curious thing for people to understand is that we have two main valleys around Jerusalem, the Kidron Valley and the Hinnom Valley, or Gehenna Valley. And in these valleys around Jerusalem, there were many tombs full of what? Bones. Dry bones, because many of these tombs were not family ones, they were collective. Several people were placed there. So you imagine Jerusalem surrounded by tombs full of dry bones, a valley of dry bones. What does that remind you of?
This reminds us precisely of the prophecy that speaks of the return to life of the valley of dry bones, which was precisely found in archaeological excavations, was found in Qumran, and also was found in Masada, precisely these scrolls.
Exactly. That is when God speaks with the prophet, prophesies to these bones to return, and then the wind of God comes and the bones return. That is, the prophetic image that the seer could perceive was based on what he also knew. But we have another curiosity here, Aline. You talked about the old tomb. It's true. But these tombs, originally, they still had another layer that came here. The stone was cut in antiquity, they ceased to be a tomb, and they cut here for some reason to perhaps make Herod's own retaining wall, which perhaps even passed through some part here to hold his palace. I even imagine that this must have caused a great religious disturbance at the time, because messing with the place of the dead. But Herod was not very concerned with public opinion. He was more concerned with his glory.
Exactly. I mean, Herod builds great constructions. Even today, the greatest archaeological finds in the Holy Land are all from Herod. We can see Herodium, for example. He builds an artificial mountain, and inside this artificial mountain, a fortress. And also in it, he places his mausoleum. He builds Masada, which is a fortress on top of a mountain in the middle of the desert. He builds the construction over the tomb of the patriarchs of the cave of Machpelah. He builds the city of Caesarea Maritima with theaters and hippodromes, one of the largest ports of the ancient world. And the list goes on to the Tower of David, too, which is not of David. We talked about Herodias. That is, he makes colossal constructions. In the few decades that he reigned, he managed to leave a very large historical mark, both for his wickedness, but also for his constructions.
And we can reconstruct what this would be like from two main sources. These are the palaces that Aline mentioned, because we know that the architectural style was the same. For example, that issue I mentioned about the type of stone, we know it's Herodian. So we make architectural comparisons of the palaces. And the second source, Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian from the 1st century, who lived here, who saw Jerusalem being destroyed by the Romans, and he wrote the Jewish Antiquities and the War of the Jews. And in these works, he describes what Jerusalem was like as he saw it in detail. So he talks about the stones, and he describes the palace that was here. And we have other important information from Flavius Josephus that after the death of Herod, the Roman governors, when they came to Jerusalem, stayed at Herod's palace. This is important because let me explain to you that many people get confused in the Bible when they read Herod ordering the killing of the infants in Bethlehem. Then they read Herod participating in the trial of Jesus, and they think it's the same person. Isn't it, Aline? But there are several Herods. Explain a little bit about that to us.
So when we talk about Herod, usually we don't say anything else. We normally refer to King Herod the Great, who was the first of the Herodian dynasty.
Built all this. Who
made 99% of the buildings is actually Herod the Great. And after he dies, the kingdom is divided among his sons. Among them are Herod Antipas, Herod Philip. There's also Herod Archelaus. Then his grandsons, like Herod Agrippa. There's Herod Agrippa the Annos, Herod Agrippa II. And that's why we see very late in the Bible also, for example, when Felix is with Herod, in reality, it's not Herod the Great. It's not that he lived for centuries, but rather there were several kings called King Herod. There's King Herod the Great, and the others carry a second name.
It's like Caesars. You had Augustus Caesar, Tiberius Caesar, Caligula Caesar, Claudius Caesar, Nero Caesar. Herod also wanted his name to be perpetuated. Let's keep walking here because
Flavio
Jose will tell about the sumptuousness of this palace. And as we cross paths with Flavio Jose, with a part of the Bible that I will read in a little while, you will see that the story fits together. Aline mentioned that this find here is still causing controversy among historians and archaeologists. Is that true? Why? For those who have visited Israel, Aline has been a guide there for many years and is knowledgeable about it. Usually people walk around inside Jerusalem in a part called Via Dolorosa. We respect the faith of all people, and there is a whole emotional issue about the Via Dolorosa, but from a historical and archaeological point of view, I am obliged to say with all due respect, not taking away anyone's faith, nor does Aline want to do this, that from a historical point of view, the Via Dolorosa is definitely not the street that Jesus passed through. So the idea of Jesus carrying the cross through the streets of Jerusalem, which we see today, doesn't make sense. Because this Via Dolorosa is meters above the floor from the time of Jesus. Its layout has been changed several times. And when you go through the Via Dolorosa, you have several stations and even many priests, both from the Catholic Church and Orthodox Greek, recognize that these are symbols of Christ's passion and not necessarily historical events. And there are the stations. And at one of these stops on the Via Dolorosa, there is a place called Etiomo. Etiomo in Latin means behold the man. This passage is taken from the Latin version of the Gospels, when Pilate presents Jesus to the crowd, and the crowd asks to crucify Jesus, and Pilate says, behold the man Etiomo. And it was found there, especially when priests from the congregation of Notre Dame de Sion, which was a Catholic congregation founded by Father Hatzbon, by his brother, they came and bought lands here in Jerusalem, the congregation of Hatzbon, and they bought this building within the old city. And when they were cleaning there, the nuns, to be able to make a structure, they discovered a very large stone pavement. In a little while, I will show you in the Gospel of John, it says that Jesus was condemned and he was flogged by the soldiers on a stone pavement that in Greek is called lidostrotos. I'll show this to you in the Bible later. How did they find that pavement? They said, oh, so this is where Jesus was judged. Then this place was identified as the Antonia Fortress, which was a building adjacent to the temple. And this building was where the Roman soldiers were watching what was happening inside the temple. If there was any turmoil, any confusion, they would come out and surround the temple. So for many years, it was believed that there, in the Antonia Fortress, would be the place of Jesus' trial inside the old city. However, archaeologically, we've always doubted this.
So in summary, what happens? We know that the Via Dolorosa, what we call the Via Dolorosa today, is the path that Jesus took from the place of judgment. We know that Jesus was judged, condemned by Pontius Pilate, and he carries the cross to the place of crucifixion. So now the question is, where did this judgment take place? And there are two theories. The most traditional theory, which also comes from the Sisters of Zion, which is the place that most people really go and know, is precisely the Antonia Fortress. Now the question is whether Pontius Pilate was inside the Antonia Fortress at the time of the trial, or if he was in Herod's palace. So this was precisely a doubt, and also for a long time no one even knew where Herod's palace was. The rediscovery of Herod's palace is something from recent years, and also precisely what was found here recently has changed many people's view of the Via Dolorosa, where the trial really happened, and that's what Rodrigo is going to show us now.
Exactly. And for us to go to another part here, let's remember the confusion. At the time when the Ottoman Empire took over all of this here, they built that minaret that Aline already showed. They also built there a fortress with style. I'm going to call it medieval, because the Middle Ages had already passed, but similar to those medieval fortresses. So it had all that stone structure, and many people thought that all of this was Ottoman construction, until more recent studies saw that a part of the lower tower structure was not Ottoman. It was from Herod himself. The Ottomans just continued it. Now let's keep walking, because then an important piece of the puzzle comes in that suggests a new hypothesis for the place where Jesus was condemned by Pontius Pilate. Let's go. You're going to find out. Let's go.
There.
I've already got my Bible, but we stopped here halfway because I think it's much more didactic here for you to see the overlap of walls. Down here we have a very clear wall from the time of King Herod. And notice that the stones are different in the middle, right? Instead of a later period. And further up, Ottoman period.
Here we can precisely see the timeline, and we can see the different historical periods, how one covers the other. As seen in this drawing, it reflects what we observe in reality, layer upon layer of the city. And so we keep digging over time and rediscovering history. See?
Exactly. Now let's get closer there, where there is this finding that added another piece to the puzzle, what the Bible says about it, and also Flavio Jose. Let's continue. Let's go. I find it very fascinating, Aline, when we start to compare what we are seeing today with what those who lived in the past wrote. This is a map to help us understand all of this. That's why we're talking a lot about the Bible, the New Testament, and also Flavio Jose. I think it's interesting for people to know more.
Yes, for those who don't know Flavio Jose, as was said, he was a historian from the 1st century, right around the time of Jesus, a little after. He was one of the leaders of the Jewish rebellion against the Romans. He coordinated the rebellion in the city of Yotfat in the north of Israel. But as we know, the Jews lost this battle and the Romans took him as a prisoner, and he would spend the rest of his life as a prisoner of the Romans. But at the same time, he would have many privileges that others did not have. So during these years that he will be in captivity, will be imprisoned by the Romans, he will write the entire history of the time he lived and also of some previous centuries. So we have a description in the smallest details of what Jerusalem was like, because he had all the time in the world in prison to write the books, and he lived here and really knew closely the reality of that time.
He functioned like a kind of war reporter, you know? One was by Vespasian. Vespasian came with an army, surrounded the city, and Flavius Josephus was already with him at that time. But at a certain point, it is said that Flavius Josephus greeted Vespasian, who was just a Roman general, as if he were an emperor, "Hail Caesar." And Vespasian was startled by that, and shortly after, in fact, Vespasian was called back to Rome because he would be enthroned as the new emperor of Rome. So Vespasian was like, wow, then he even increased Josephus's prestige because of that. Then Vespasian leaves with the army, but then they return now under the command of Titus, who is really going to cause the destruction of Jerusalem. But going back to a period before this destruction of the year 70, let's talk about the time of Jesus. Some information from Joseph is very accurate. One of them, I said that Herod's palace, the Great, after his death, served as a place for Roman governors. I think it's good for Aline to also explain a bit to the people that Herod, he lost his sons, better saying, lost the autonomy, the right to govern Jerusalem. We're talking about one of them, Archelaus, because when he died, his kingdom was divided among his sons. Archelaus would be the governor of Judea and here in Jerusalem, but Archelaus was a terrible administrator. What did the Romans do?
So that is, Herod divides the kingdom into three. Among his three main sons, Herod Archelaus gets the government of Judea, that is Jerusalem and around. But he really is going to be a very bad administrator. And look, for the Romans to like Herod, to find his son bad, really the son must have been a very bad administrator. And that's why they take him out of power and put from then on, from the year 6 AD, pagan Roman governors to govern Judea. And these governors, being pagans, they didn't feel very comfortable here in Jerusalem. Jerusalem in the end was and continues to be the capital of the people of Israel. It was Jewish.
Too much for them.
Exactly. The temple here was a Jewish temple. It was a Jewish city. And what was the largest pagan Roman city in Judea? Caesarea Maritima. And that's why they moved the capital from Jerusalem to Caesarea Maritima, where there were pagan temples. Imagine the first thing people saw when they arrived in Caesarea Maritima was a huge temple dedicated to Emperor Augustus and the goddess Roma. There were pagan games, hippodromes, gladiator games, and that's why these governors preferred to govern from there. So Pontius Pilate did not live in Jerusalem. He lived in Caesarea Maritima. But because of the Jewish Passover celebrations, which is a very conducive time for Jewish rebellions, he comes to Jerusalem, and where does he stay?
In Herod's palace.
This is important.
There was a Roman intervention, you know, when one country has an intervention on another and puts an outside administrator. And remember that this maritime Caesarea that Aline mentioned was another of the mega constructions of Herod the Great. He wanted to make a port here to rival the great port of the Appian Way in Rome. In fact, Caesarea was the second largest port in the entire Roman Empire. His construction there is incredible. And Herod, being very politically inclined towards the Romans, paganized much of that place there, putting everything good and best or bad and worst, depending on the point of view, of Roman culture. That's why the procurators, Roman prefects, were better installed there and only came here for religious festivals. Then we already have this information. So if the Roman governors stayed here, it doesn't make sense to say that they stayed at the Antonia fortress, especially because in this place that we know is the Antonia fortress, there is no palatial structure as we find here. There is no luxury, there is no bathhouse, there is no swimming pool, no Roman bath. And here we have these things. So, if they stayed here, and among these Roman procurators who came here, one of them was Pontius Pilate. Now, if Pontius Pilate was a Roman procurator and they came here, then it was behind these walls that Pontius Pilate stayed. If it was here, it makes total sense that they brought Jesus here to be judged by Pontius Pilate. But to tell this story, we have to go a little over there to show what Flavius Josephus says about all this. There's a sign over there that will show a drawing so you can understand better. Let's take a quick look. Aline, this sign here is not pretty at all. It's risky, but it's educational for the folks at home to understand. What's right behind us there is drawn here. By the way, it's also good to make it clear here that one of the main researchers behind all this is the archaeologist Shimon Gibson, a famous Israeli archaeologist who lives in the United States. But he has made a significant contribution to the archaeology of the Second Temple, which for us is the time of Jesus. We have here the wall from the Herodian era, right? The walls are here as they were. Here is the Tower of Phasael, which we saw back there. And here originally there was another tower. This tower is notable for its mention by Flavius Josephus. According to Flavius Josephus, there was Herod's palace on the western wall, which is exactly where we are. And here there was a protection tower and an entrance with two parts of the same entrance, as if it were a wing called Caesarean and the other Agrippian, that is, it would be a door with two bands, and it would be here. This tower that Flavius Josephus mentions, and that appeared there in the drawing, it would be right here behind. So, behind these walls originally was Herod's palace, a large palace from the corner to here. This also helps to understand another thing, because in the trial of Jesus, it's not just Pontius Pilate who appears, Herod also appears.
Exactly, Herod the son.
But did this Herod live here or not? No?
Herod Antipas lived in Galilee. Exactly, they were all politicians there.
In the bad
sense of the word. I mean, Pontius Pilate tries to throw this responsibility of the trial to Herod Antipas. He says, look, Jesus is Galilean. This man who is being accused is Galilean. You, Herod Antipas, are the governor of Galilee. Take the responsibility, it's yours. But what then will Herod Antipas respond? He will say, no, this man who is being accused, he is Galilean, but the crimes he is being accused of were committed in Judea, and therefore the jurisdiction is yours. Pontius and Pilate then have precisely this dialogue between the two that nobody really wants to take the blame, so to speak, for having crucified Jesus. And
why is that? Here's the thing, folks. Imagine everything that Aline is saying about the political game of the time. Let's move over here, Aline. Jesus was a controversial figure because the Jewish leaders of that time wanted Jesus' death. I'm talking especially about the scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, who controlled the temple. But Jesus had a large part of the population supporting him. Remember that days before he had entered Jerusalem, riding a little donkey with people shouting, and sent Hosanna to the Son of David. So imagine now with the mind of a politician. Pilate was here to solve the rebellion problems of the Jews. So it wasn't easy to keep the people calm. If he kills Jesus, it could provoke a civil war from Jesus' sympathizers. If he spares Jesus, the Jewish politicians of the time would deliver his head on a platter to Caesar. Look, he's supporting someone who wants to be king in place of Caesar. So, in this situation, to avoid any trouble, when he saw that Jesus was from Galilee, he tossed the hot potato to Herod. Herod, who didn't care less about the color of the banana, returned the case to Pilate. And here is yet another piece of evidence that this episode makes no sense to have occurred there at the Antonia fortress, because besides not having a palatial structure, it was just a fortress for the changing of the guard of the soldiers who watched over the temple. So it doesn't make sense that this would have happened there. Now, the Bible says that Pilate and Herod were at odds with each other, but both were in Jerusalem. Surely here we have a structure that justifies a palace large enough for two rulers to each occupy a part of the palace. Perhaps Pilate stayed on this side and Herod stayed at the other end of the palace, and also large enough to accommodate the two governors something that can't be done in the Antonia fortress, but at the same time, close enough for Pilate to send Jesus to Herod and Herod to return him to Pilate.
All of this in the few hours of a Friday morning. Exactly. That is, a lot happened in a few hours. It's interesting because when Jesus was arrested, he was first arrested by Caiaphas, who was the high priest of the Jerusalem temple, but he was there as the right hand of Pontius and Pilate. That is, it wasn't the people of Israel, it wasn't the Jews who chose Caiaphas as the high priest. Yes, at that time it was the Romans who elected much of the temple elite because the Romans understood how much power and influence this elite had in the city. So when Caiaphas has Jesus with him in the early morning, he also doesn't want to kill Jesus. Why? Because he also has this political side that he doesn't want them to be accused of having done this. And so Caiaphas passes to Pilate, Pilate to Herod, Herod returns to Pilate. So none of them want to take the blame in the end for the death of Jesus, precisely because they knew that this could cause a rebellion. One thing I always find interesting is that I think the fear that Pilate had is very justified. The Jewish Passover feast, it is also called in the Bible as Hag Acherut, the Feast of Freedom. It is a date that the people of Israel celebrate freedom, how God took the people of Israel with a strong hand from the slavery of Egypt. We are celebrating our freedom, while at that same time the people were in oppression at the hands of the Romans. So this fear of Pilate of a rebellion, I think, is completely justified. And I see how this Jewish thought has not changed over time, because during the Second World War, during the Holocaust, when there were several rebellions during the Holocaust, but the biggest rebellion during the Holocaust was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It took a long time to plan, and when did it start? On the first day of the Jewish Passover. That is, the Jews 2,000 years ago already had this desire to rebel against the Romans and be a free people in their own land. We also see this desire to be, at that time, at least have the dignity to survive. So we see that this feeling has not changed, and that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising also happens precisely on the first day of Jewish Passover, even almost 2,000 years between one event and another.
Look how interesting. I'm going to take advantage of this before getting into the part that I want to ask a question to Aline, but before, put another historical note on the difficulty they had. Under Roman law at the time, Jewish authorities did not have the legal power to sentence someone to death. And then there was an ethical religious problem, because when a person committed a crime of blasphemy, for example, according to the law of Moses, she should be stoned outside the camp. But how are you going to stone someone when you can't, under Roman law, do that? So one technique that existed was the following. You threw the person off the cliff, because throwing off the cliff, for Rome, either she fell, and for the law of Moses, we stoned. Because it hit the stone. It doesn't matter if it's the stone that hits you or you on the stone, you were stoned anyway. Owned. Now, so they could arrest Jesus, but they couldn't sentence Jesus to death. They needed Pilate to do that. Now, since Aline brought up this issue of the Jews, even making the comparison with the Warsaw Ghetto, it's good to clarify one thing. It's often said out there, the Jews killed Jesus, the Jews crucified Jesus. The Bible says the Jews, but let's understand this a little bit. Aline, how does it work? You are Jewish. How does this work? Did the Jews kill Jesus? Let's refine this story a little bit. Who were these Jews? Was it the entire population? What do you think?
So, without a doubt, it wasn't the entire population. The Bible itself tells us this. It says that Jesus was in Galilee and thousands of people followed him. When he was in Jericho, a crowd followed him. There was the triumphant entry. We have so many proofs that there were Jews who loved Jesus. There were disciples of Jesus. The majority, in reality, the majority of Jesus' disciples were
Jews, but
there were also Jews who were not good people. I think that's what people have to understand. Understand, Jews are a people like any other people. If we take today the Brazilian nation, I believe that most of the Brazilian nation are good-hearted people and are good people, but there are also bad people in Brazil. And the same thing, the people of Israel is a people, and there are very good people. I believe that most of the people are good, but there are also bad and corrupt people. This in today's days, in ancient times. And I think we can see the clear example of corrupt and evil people with Annas, with Caiaphas, with other people of the elite. But most of the people indeed wanted the good of Jesus, or at least did not want his harm. Not all the people of the land of Israel knew who Jesus was, but we can see that in the triumphant land, there are thousands of people there accompanying. And here on the day of judgment, yes, there is a small minority that is shouting, asking for the crucifixion of Jesus, but they are not the majority, the first thing. And secondly, I always see this. When Jesus was inside the prison, the Bible itself tells us that when Jesus is inside the prison, Peter is outside and he will deny Jesus 3 times. That is one of Jesus' disciples, one of Jesus' 12 apostles. He doesn't have the courage
To say,
that he knew Jesus. And now what are you going to expect from most people, or from the people who were here, who was going to be the one to challenge the authorities, who was going to challenge Pontius and Pilate, who was going to challenge the priests and shout there, no, release Jesus. So yes, there were bad people who wanted to condemn him, and the good people were scared. And I think that's also important, a lesson for today. For evil to happen, it's not necessary for the majority of people to want evil, but rather it's necessary for the majority of people to remain silent. I think that also happened here. Besides some minority that wanted to condemn Jesus, the majority remained silent at that moment.
that's clear. Martin Luther King said that what he feared most was not the abuse of the wicked, but the silence of the good. So, it happened. I wouldn't like to have Brazil represented by some bad examples of Brazilians that are out there. So when they ask me why the Jews rejected Jesus, they are obviously thinking of Caiaphas, Annas. I ask around, wait a minute, why did the Jews accept Jesus? Thinking of Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, the Apostle John, the Virgin Mary, everyone was Jewish. The entire New Testament, with the probable exception of Luke, was written by Jews. So we have to be careful that the noisy minority does not become the whole story. Now, since we're talking about history, we've learned a lot here in the video, haven't we, Aline? Shall we send it over? Let's do it.
There.
We've already seen that Herod stayed here, Pontius Pilate too. Their palace extended up to here. Look closely, it's quite large. I don't know if the video can capture it, but try to show the minaret again in the front so people can get an idea of how far we've walked from there to here. And all this wall that you're seeing up to about the height of a tree that's there in the back, that tree there, up to there was a huge palace of Herod. Now, as I mentioned, Flavio Jose mentions this place, this door that was here, and it is also called the Praetorium. It's a word that will appear in the New Testament. Praetorium, that's why there's some controversy. What is the Praetorium? What is the Praetorian Guard? Despite a different opinion here and there, more or less consensually, the Praetorian Guard is that guard who are the personal bodyguards of the governor, those who stay closer to him. You know, at the Vatican, there's the Swiss Guard, who take care of the papal quarters. It would be something like that. We have, for example, there, in Caesarea Maritima, which Aline mentioned, there is also the Praetorian Guard, which was nearby. So when the governor, the emperor, the king, the leader moved, that Praetorian Guard was the one that went with him. And when he settled in a certain palace, the guard also camped there. There were even rooms for the Praetorian Guard, where they would stay there really protecting. Here probably was the place of the Praetorian Guard, because what Flavius Josephus said is what we found here, Aline. He talks about the staircase that was here on the outside. And we have a staircase here. Look closely, we have a wall here, a small stone wall here. Do you see it? On this side, there's another small wall too. Are you able to show it, love? Are you comfortable there in the video? Can the folks at home see? And now the surprise, Aline. Let's walk here. Let's climb up 2,000-year-old stairs.
Wow, look.
Here, one step, another step, another step. You see there was a staircase here. And it wasn't a common staircase. It was a very sumptuous staircase, so much so that the steps are quite wide. Here, evidently, this staircase collapsed, but it's interesting that this staircase is still here. It remained here, And there on the wall, it has another staircase that leads to a place they call the hidden door. Why hidden door? You'll understand from home. The hill will come close here. We will see there are remains, obviously 2,000 years of history. A lot has collapsed. But you can see there, Modica, that there are remains of a staircase step that leads nowhere because there is the wall there, obviously the 16th century wall. This 16th century wall is blocking an original entrance that was here. Maybe that two-door entrance that Flavio Jose mentioned. And it's not just that. Here we also have, right up there, a stone pavement at that height, which really looks like that platform, or lithostrodos, which is mentioned in the Gospel of John. Now look how interesting. The governor could go out through that staircase, right? Up there is a stone pavement, and it went down to here and the staircase continued. Now, a question, if there was this staircase here, but the palace was inside, let's think a little bit. What is the function of a staircase like this? You at home, think with me and Aline here. What do you think? The palace is in there. A special door with an opening, with a stone platform up there, and the staircase continues sumptuous to a public part. What does it seem?
This is a place where originally King Herod or the kings after him could come out and speak directly to the public.
Exactly. The politician likes to show off, right?
Platform.
Let's turn to the Gospel of John, Aline. See how interesting it is. When I read the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 28, it says, "Then they took Jesus from the house of Caiaphas." Another important detail. Remember that I showed that the palace went up near that tree there? When we see in the model of Jerusalem, the house of the high priest of Annas Caiaphas, it was in that direction there in front, in what people today call Mount Zion or Gallicanto, that region there. More or less in that direction, there was the house of Caiaphas. So it makes sense. Jesus is taken from the Mount of Olives to there. Early the next morning, he is taken from there and taken to Pilate. Who knows? Maybe Jesus was brought here. Why? Look closely. Then they took Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the Praetorium. Remember when I mentioned the Praetorian Guard? It was early in the morning. They did not enter the Praetorium so as not to defile themselves, so they could eat the Passover. Then Pilate went out to speak with them. Folks, it makes all sense. They did not enter Pilate's palace. And the only public access that was there was this one. There is no other. It is the access that is described by Flavius Josephus. It is the access that we discovered through archaeology. So I can't prove away any questioning. But the possibility is very high that Pilate came here by
these tables,
stairs, to know what is the demand that you have, what is the problem. And those leaders of the people were with a mob here. So Pilate went out to speak with them and asked, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" Then they said, "This man wants to be king in place of Caesar," etc., etc. And there was that game. Pilate perhaps took Jesus inside, the crowd waiting here for a verdict. There he sends Jesus to Herod. At the other end, Jesus goes through Herod, but Herod returns to Pilate. And then it says the following. Let's read another passage that says here, look, therefore, chapter 19, verse 1, Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on Jesus' head. They also dressed him in a purple robe. They came up to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they slapped him. Pilate came out again and said to the Jews, "Behold, I bring him out to you that you may know that I find no fault in him." Then Jesus came out. He had left the palace to come out. Jesus came out probably on that part of the stones there where the people could see, on that platform. Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the guards saw Jesus, they shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him." The Jews responded, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." And going back into the Praetorium, Pilate asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" Then Jesus said that he was from Galilee, and it's the moment when Pilate then tries to take him back to Herod, and the rest we have already seen. In other words, all this part that the Bible describes, it fits very well with what we are seeing here. The bigger controversy is this, Aline, being this, from an archaeological point of view, a strong, I would say very strong candidate for the trial of Jesus. This could change a good part of the historical understanding, even of where Calvary would be. But that would be a topic for another video, for another opportunity.
Indeed, really, as the years go by, the excavations are progressing, we have a much greater understanding, and that's why when we want to know where the biblical stories really took place, we have many ways to know. We have ancient writings, we have the Bible itself, we have archaeological excavations, we have traditions as well. Traditions have their importance, but sometimes traditions can also be wrong. So it's precisely about putting this puzzle together. And this puzzle of the Praetorium as this place, really as the place of Jesus' trial, is a theory that is being developed. And with these new excavations, it is really being strengthened. And also because we are now outside the walls, but on the inside, archaeological excavations were also made, and parts of King Herod's pools were found. Parts of the foundations of King Herod's palace were found. So it's not just the evidence that we are seeing here from the outside. There is also evidence from the inside, and they are putting this puzzle together. And the question now is, where was Jesus really judged? And I think we can't be absolutely sure. I think we have to go back in time to
actually witness
where everything happened. But we are really in a very strong candidate to be the true location. And
to finish our video, I want to show you this stone platform that I've mentioned so many times that's up there for you to understand the closure of this trial of Jesus. Shall we see this last part?
Let's go.
So come with us.
Can I just show one thing?
Look.
Here, folks. Wherever we walk here in Jerusalem, we find pieces of pottery. Rodrigo, can you identify the period?
No, this one, no. It's diagnosable. It's from the Roman period. I don't know if the video will allow people to see, Aline, but it has some grooves here, some typical lines. I'll put it in the shadow like this to make it easier for people to see, which is an indication that it's a pottery from the Roman period that is 2,000 years old. From these lines here inside, we can tell that it's from the Roman period.
So look here, folks. This is a little piece of pottery that we found here on the way. We'll return it to the same place. But this just proves how much more can still be discovered here.
Yes, tomorrow there could be another archaeological find that will still change a lot. But let's now explore this part of the stone pavement. Aline, notice that here there is a platform of stones and that it is probably from the Second Temple. Herodian, we have a continuity of it here. Do you see? Look, with massive stones, Josephus describes that they were large stones. And for you who are watching from home, imagine that here, I hope you can see that it is an entire floor of ancient stones. It is a platform that was here. And we also have some steps in this corner here that sometimes served as a tribune. So imagine that the person had this platform of stones, a tribune, from which he could address the people there. He could leave there to be closer to the people. In other words, all of this here cooperates with the description of the Herodian Praetorium, or used by Pilate. Then when we go to the Gospel of John, we have this other passage here that draws a lot of attention. I'm going to read it to you here. Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 13. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the stone pavement, or in Greek, lithostrotos. Lithostrotos, lithos in Greek is stone. Trotos is platform. You don't say road, is that right? Stratigraphy, stone pavement, and John goes even further. He gives the Hebrew name, he says the following, Pilate sat on the judgment seat in a place called pavement, in Hebrew, Gabata. It was the day of preparation for the Passover feast around noon, and Pilate said again to the Jews, "Behold, here is your king." As you said, we can't be absolutely sure, but the chance, or at least as a candidate, this is a very strong place. Now, even though we can't make a final decision here and stick to it, we can't go back in time. One thing is a fact. What happened on that Easter of Jesus' death, someplace in the year 31, others put in the year 33, that revolutionized history in such a way that even today, this episode is not forgotten. I am very happy to be here with you, Aline, having the opportunity to show this place so that people can see the Bible in a three-dimensional way.
Indeed, we can understand even more how the story happened. I mean, to take and be able to read the verses and understand how things happened. When you said that he sits, I mean, a good chance he sat here, then the Bible really gains even more colors and even more life being here in Israel.
Exactly. Well, I hope you enjoyed this content, and always remember to follow Aline on the channel Israel with Aline. And
we are at Rodrigo Silva Archaeology.
Together, a personal hug